For some reason, we as a sports-watching society seem incapable of just appreciating greatness, perpetually caught up in the never-ending rush to anoint someone the next, the best, the greatest. And as that conversation pertains to the NBA, perhaps no individual sport has such a diverse and varied amount of answers to the question of who is the greatest player of all time. And fundamentally, the answer to that question lies with each individual person and with what metrics they hold to be most valuable. The consensus answer for the better part of 3 decades, and yes, still overwhelmingly believed to be the sport's all-time GOAT, Michael Jordan, holds that designation not because he was the greatest winner, not because he was the most individually statistically dominant, and certainly not because his bulk statistical accumulation met the gaudy totals of other all-time greats who played substantially longer than he did. No, Jordan is still universally considered the declarative answer to that question of who the greatest is, because he represents the greatest total package in basketball history. His unique combination of aesthetically pleasing aerial assaults, coupled with the skill, the will, the defense, and above all, most importantly, the winning during the compact amount of time he played in the league was higher than anyone we had seen before or since. Of course, we are talking about this premise of one's peak, but perhaps the better way to establish this peak dominance, though, is to determine how great an individual player was compared to their peers. How forcefully did they reign over their generation of players? And most typically, professional basketball has been broken down into eras. But when and where does an era begin and end? Well, the cleanest and most precise way to break these eras up is by decade. And generally, the individuals who owned each decade, beginning in the 1960s and running all the way until today, are generally the individuals most commonly found in these top 10 conversations and GOAT debates. But who are the GOATs of each decade, and how thoroughly did they dominate their specific eras? In order to determine the greatest players of all time, join me for an in-depth 7-part series breaking down each decade, starting with the 1960s. And in this decade, Wilt Chamberlain dominated from a statistical standpoint like no other player did in any decade ever, and it isn't close. His 24,719 points during this 10-year span are the most in NBA history, and his 34-point-per-game scoring average is also the most ever. But as dominant as Chamberlain was statistically, he wasn't in a class of his own in this category, as the Big O, Oscar Robertson, also rose to prominence during the 60s. And there's a reason he earned the moniker Mr. Triple-Double, with decade averages of 29 points per game, 10 assists, and 8.5 rebounds. And overall, the decade of the 1960s was just on one from a statistical standpoint due to out-of-this-world pace of play and nightly scoring averages not seen since in the entire history of basketball until, well, today. Average nightly league scoring for that 10-year span was 115 points per game, which is by far the highest scoring and fastest paced decade ever, with the only time coming even close to that being our current NBA, which has seen league-wide scoring averages swell to over 114 points per game these last 2 seasons. I mean, Elgin Baylor, who was generally an afterthought in this decade, dropped nearly 28 points, 13 rebounds, and 4.5 assists per night on average during these 10 years. Just take a look at this legendary 1961-62 league MVP race, easily the most absurd in NBA history. In this year, Wilt Chamberlain averaged 50 points per game for a full season and threw on 26 rebounds per game for good measure, while playing all 82 games, and due to how many overtime games he was a part of, averaged 48.5 minutes per night.
What?
Yes, you heard that right. And yes, there were still only 48 minutes in an NBA basketball game back then. In addition to that preposterous season by Wilt, Oscar Robertson averaged 31 points per game, 12 rebounds, and 11 assists that very same season. Hell, even Elgin Baylor averaged 38 points, 19 rebounds, and 4.5 assists. This was all in the same season, and yet none of these players won the MVP that year. And it's important to note that the MVP voting that season, as with every season up until the 1980-81 league year, was not voted on by a panel of biased, know-nothing media jock sniffers. No, it was voted on by the people whose opinions matter most, the players. And I wonder how differently the MVP awards over the last 40 years would look if the players continued to vote on it. Anyway, in that legendary 61-62 season, it wasn't Wilt's nightly 50 spot or Oscar's triple-double averages. Nope, the players decided that with the Boston Celtics becoming the first team to that point in NBA history to win 60 games, Bill Russell should be awarded league MVP. And this gets us to the crux of this decade. Wilt Chamberlain was unquestionably the most individually dominant, with a major honorable mention shout out to Oscar Robertson. But Wilt won only one NBA title during this decade, while the Big O won none. All of this as Bill Russell was the linchpin of the greatest dynasty in professional basketball history, capturing 8 championships in the decade of the 1960s, and that was while he only played in 9 of the 10 seasons, retiring at the end of the 1968-69 league year. Therefore, Russell won 8 championships in the 9 years he played during the 1960s. And that is why, despite Wilt Chamberlain nearly tripling Bill Russell in points scored, while more than doubling him in points per game, while playing more minutes, grabbing more rebounds, and shooting a drastically higher field goal percentage, and also dominating the efficiency acronym metrics that get the writers all hot and bothered today, like VORP, BPM, and PER. Yes, despite Wilt dominating this decade in all of those individual measurables, many believe this decade belonged to Bill Russell. Because at the end of the day, winning matters. And it always has, until, well, most recently. And because Russell won at such an extreme level throughout this decade, he is and likely will continue to be considered the GOAT of the 1960s. And while that does conclude our look at the 60s, make sure to subscribe.
Okay. Do it. Do it.
And tune in for the next episode of the GOAT by decade, when we take a look at the most competitively balanced 10-year span in NBA history, the 70s. Until next time.